Today, I've prepared my new original story for the Purple Heart Stories channel. It tells about family values and what it means to be a real man and protector of loved ones, even when stabbed in the back with the knife of betrayal. Support with a like and subscription if you enjoy it. Chapter 1: Return to Roots. My name is Mike Donovan. 38 years old, 20 of them in the Marine Corps, 3 combat wounds and 1 huge unhealing wound in my soul. My wife Laura is 8 years younger and looks at the world as if it owes her something. After finishing my military service, I suggested we return to my grandfather's farm to start a new life together without endless deployments and expectations that we might be seeing each other for the last time. But fate had other plans. A sharp turn occurred the day I discovered that Laura wasn't happy about the prospect of a quiet, peaceful life on the edge of the world, and my old army friend, whom I thought was dead, appeared on the doorstep of the ranch. And in his arms was a wounded teenager who announces to Laura and me that he is my son. The morning was clear and cold, with that special transparency of air that only comes at the beginning of autumn. The grass, still wet with dew, left dark traces on my army boots as I walked across the abandoned field to the house standing on a hilltop. The old Donovan farm, my heritage, my ancestral home. The house looked tired. The paint on the walls was peeling, the porch was crooked, several roof tiles were missing. But the frame, massive oak beams that my grandfather Patrick had brought here by horse almost 150 years ago, stood strong, as befitting the backbone of a real home. God, Mike, it's even worse than I imagined. Laura stood behind me, arms wrapped around herself as if from cold, though the day promised to be warm. I looked at her, a neat ponytail of chestnut hair, slim jeans, city sneakers already stained with country dust. Her green eyes showed poorly concealed disappointment. I knew she had hoped for something different when she agreed to come here with me after my retirement. Maybe a cute suburb with weekend barbecues and neighbors discussing the latest TV shows. But not this. There's a lot of work, I agreed, but the house is solid. Grandpa built it to last. Laura shrugged, and I felt the familiar tension between us. It had appeared even before my last deployment and only intensified after my injury, as if we were speaking different languages and each thought the other just wasn't trying to understand. I'll start with the roof, I decided, not waiting for an answer. If it starts raining, we're done for. Over the following days, I worked like a man possessed. I woke up before dawn and finished when I could no longer distinguish tools in the gathering darkness. I replaced the roof tiles, patched holes in the walls, scrubbed the floors until they shone. Each nail hammered, each board sanded brought me closer to something I couldn't articulate. Redemption, peace with myself. The work kept the nightmares at bay. The more physically exhausted I became, the less I was haunted by images of the guys from my unit who were blown up by a roadside mine in Kandahar. Their screams still came at night, but quieter now, as if muffled by the sound of hammering and the scraping of the saw. On the first Sunday at the farm, I was cleaning the silt-choked pond when I heard the sound of an approaching car. An old pickup with rusty sides stopped at the house, and a lean old man in a faded plaid shirt got out. "Hello, neighbor, remember Tucker?" he asked, approaching and extending a calloused hand. "Eddie Tucker, farm next door." I vaguely remembered this man from my childhood, the perpetually grumpy neighbor who sometimes brought us fresh apples and pumpkins on Thanksgiving. "Of course, Mr. Tucker," I replied, shaking his hand. "Good to see you again." "To hell with Mister," he grumbled. "Call me Eddie. I'm already too old for such formalities." He looked over the pond I was working on. "Not bad. The Donovans always knew their land. Your grandfather used to say, 'The land remembers everything and forgives nothing.' Wise man." Something like respect flickered in his eyes. Tucker pulled a tattered pack of cigarettes from his pocket and offered me one. I declined. I'd quit in the hospital. "Brought you something," he said, pointing to the pickup. "Seeds for the northern field. The soil there holds moisture better if you're planning to grow anything. I was touched by this gesture. In war and in ordinary life, people rarely do something without an ulterior motive. Thanks, Eddie, that's very timely. He nodded, not requiring thanks. Heard what happened to your unit, he said suddenly. Rough. I tensed. I don't like talking about it. It was rough, I agreed briefly. I was in Vietnam, continued Tucker, looking somewhere past me. Mekong Delta, 69. Stuff happens, and the worst is when it's not you but your guys, and you can't do anything. My breath caught. He understood, really understood. How did you deal with it? I asked, surprised at my own candor. Tucker smiled bitterly. I didn't, son. You just keep living, day by day, and at some point you realize you can breathe again without thinking about it every second. We were silent, sharing this moment of understanding that needed no words. Then Eddie clapped me on the shoulder. Come to church on Sunday. Reverend Jones was also in the Army as a chaplain. You'll have something to talk about, and Sheriff Mortensen will be there. He was friends with your father. After Tucker left, I took the seeds to the barn and returned to work. For the first time in a long while, I felt that I might have made the right choice coming back here. In the evening, exhausted but satisfied with the work done, I entered the house. Laura was sitting on the porch with her phone, but seeing me, she quickly put it in her pocket. Met the neighbor, I said, washing my hands under the faucet. Eddie Tucker. Remember I told you about him? That old man who talks to cows, she asked without much interest. He's a Vietnam veteran, I replied, feeling an inexplicable desire to defend Tucker. And a good man. He's inviting us to church on Sunday. We'll meet the locals. Laura rolled her eyes. Delightful. Holy Mass and conversations about types of fertilizer. The dream of my life. I swallowed a sharp response. Another argument wouldn't solve our problems. This is our chance to start a life here, Laura. To become part of the community. I know, Mike, her voice softened. It's just, this is all so different from what I'm used to. Give me time, okay? I nodded, feeling the tension ease a bit. Maybe with time she would love this place as much as I did. On Sunday we went to the local church, a small white building with a bell tower standing on a hill in the center of town. Inside it was cool and smelled of wood and candle wax. After the service, the parishioners gathered on the church lawn, where tables with refreshments were set up. Reverend Jones, a thin, gray-haired man with a penetrating gaze, was the first to approach us. Mike Donovan, he shook my hand with both of his. Glad to welcome you to our community. Your grandfather was one of the pillars of this church, and you must be Mrs. Donovan, he turned to Laura. Yes, Laura, she smiled her professional smile, which I knew well. Very beautiful church, Reverend. Tucker said you served as a chaplain, I asked. Jones nodded. 20 years, saw all sorts. That's why I know how valuable what we have here is: peace, community, the ability to just live without thinking that each day might be your last. I felt something inside me respond to his words. Not every day you manage not to think about it, I said quietly. He nodded understandingly. The church doors are always open, and not just for Sunday services. A heavy-set man in a sheriff's uniform approached us, with graying temples and an impressive belly hanging over his belt. His face seemed good-natured, but his eyes were attentive and sharp. John Mortensen, he introduced himself. Sheriff, your father was my best friend, Mike. He would be proud that you've come back to revive the family farm. We got to talking, and soon several other local residents gathered around us. While Laura chatted with the farmers' wives, clearly bored but too polite to show it, I noticed that the men's conversation had taken a more serious tone. It's all Harris, Tucker was saying, leaning over the pie table. Buying up land right and left. Already half the county is in his pocket. Robert Harris, I asked, recalling the name. He was in the junior grades when I left. The sheriff nodded. That's him. Left here as a boy, returned a wealthy businessman. Talks about reviving the town, about jobs, about a tourist complex that will turn our sleepy town into a resort. And people believe it, I was surprised. When someone offers 5 times the market price for land that hasn't brought anything but problems for 50 years, Tucker snorted. You bet they do. Reverend Jones looked at me thoughtfully. By the way, the Wilkinson farm that borders your land to the west recently went to Harris. The old man signed the papers last week. Damn it, Tucker shook his head. Now he's gotten even closer to your land, Donovan. And without your farm, his grand plan won't come together. It occupies a central position. You think he'll try to buy my land too? I asked, feeling a sudden anxiety. He'll certainly try, replied the sheriff. The question is how persistent he'll be. Tucker snorted. Persistent enough. People like Harris aren't used to hearing no. I noticed that Laura was listening to our conversation, and for the first time, I saw a genuine interest in her eyes. Is Harris married? She asked unexpectedly, interrupting her conversation with the farmers' wives. Tucker shook his head. Bachelor, lives in a big house on the hill, comes to town in a suit that costs as much as my monthly milk revenue. They say he's a heartbreaker and generous with gifts. I felt something unpleasant tighten inside when I noticed how Laura's eyes lit up. But the sheriff was already changing the subject, asking me about plans for the farm, and the moment was lost. A week later, Laura and I drove to the town supermarket for groceries and tools. I needed new parts for the tractor I was trying to revive, and the refrigerator needed restocking. Meet you at the checkout in an hour, said Laura, heading to the grocery section while I went to the construction area. The conversation with the salesperson about parts took longer than I expected. When finished, I went looking for Laura and found her in the wine section, animatedly chatting with a tall man in an expensive suit who didn't fit at all in the rural store. The man, well over 40, fit, with carefully styled dark hair and a perfect smile, stood too close to Laura. She looked more animated than I had seen her since our arrival. Laughing, touching his arm, throwing her head back, exposing her neck in a flirtatious gesture I knew too well. I approached just as the man was saying, "What is such a stunning woman doing in our backwoods? You look more like a cover model than a farmer's wife." Laura, flattered, replied with a smile. "Sometimes life takes you to the most unexpected places." I cleared my throat, and they both turned to me. "Mike," exclaimed Laura with slight surprise, "we were just talking about you." The man quickly extended his hand. "Robert Harris, you must be Mike Donovan, we finally meet." So this is what Harris had become. I shook the offered hand, feeling tension rising inside. His grip was firm but showy, as if he wanted to demonstrate strength he didn't actually possess. "I've heard about you," I said neutrally. "Seems you're actively investing in our area." Harris smiled, but his eyes remained cold. "Trying to revive what has been unjustly abandoned. I noticed your farm, excellent land, central position. I heard you've started restoration work." "Not restoration," I corrected. "Revival. The Donovan farm never died, it just temporarily fell asleep." His smile widened. "Poetic description. But allow me to note, in modern conditions small farms barely survive. Big agribusiness, economies of scale. You understand." "I'm not strong in economics," I replied, feeling irritated. "I'm more interested in tradition, history, heritage." Harris casually, as if inadvertently, touched Laura's shoulder. "Your wife is a charming woman. She told me about her work in San Diego. Such talent. In fact, I might have some propositions for her regarding PR for my new project. We should definitely discuss this in a more appropriate setting." I noticed how Laura's eyes lit up at these words. Before moving here, she had worked in a restaurant, dreaming of a career in public relations, but never got the desired promotion. That would be wonderful, she said enthusiastically. And of course, I'd like to discuss with both of you the possibilities for cooperation regarding your farm, added Harris. I'm sure we can find a mutually beneficial solution. The land is not for sale, I cut off. Harris raised his hand in a conciliatory gesture. I was talking about cooperation, not a sale, though I must admit my offer would be extremely generous. We should at least listen, Laura unexpectedly interjected. In the modern world, all options should be considered, right, Mike? I felt anger boiling up inside me, not from Harris's offer, I had seen enough of his kind, but from how easily Laura had taken his side. We need to go, I said, taking the basket with purchases. It was nice to meet you, Mr. Harris. All the way home Laura was silent, just tapping her fingers on her knee. I looked at the road, trying to calm my irritation. When we drove up to the farm, she finally spoke. You were rude. He was flirting with you right in front of me. He was being polite, she objected. Unlike you. And he was talking about a job for me, Mike. A real job, not weeding garden beds until the end of my days. I took a deep breath, trying to calm down. He wants our land, Laura, and he's using you to get to it. Or he actually sees my potential, she countered. Not all men look at me as an attachment to the farm, you know. That was a low blow. I knew how Laura had dreamed of a career of recognition. I knew that moving to the farm was a sacrifice for her. But I also felt Harris's falseness, his calculation hidden behind a perfect smile. Do what you want, I said tiredly. Just don't sell the farm while I'm not home. It was a joke, a bitter one, but a joke. Laura didn't respond, just silently got out of the car and went into the house. I remained sitting behind the wheel, looking at the fields that were beginning to come alive under my hands. Something told me that the meeting with Harris was just the beginning of our problems. In the following days, Laura became even more distant. She often went out on business to town, returned late, smelling of a subtle, unfamiliar cologne. I didn't ask questions, concentrating on work. Together with Eddie Tucker, we restored the old field irrigation system, and in the northern part of the property, I planted a trial acre of wheat using the seeds he had brought me. One day the tractor, which I had been struggling with for several days, finally refused to start. Giving up on useless attempts, I decided to return to the house earlier than usual. Laura was supposed to be in town for an interview arranged by Harris. At least, that's what she said in the morning. The house was empty. Going up to the bedroom for tools, I noticed a receipt from an expensive restaurant in the neighboring town on Laura's dressing table. Dinner for two, expensive wine. The date, 3 days ago, when Laura was supposedly at a book club meeting. Something cold and heavy settled in my chest. I didn't want to believe the obvious, but the facts were forming too clear a picture. All day I fiddled with the generator, trying not to think about Laura and her lies. When it got dark, I sat on the porch with a bottle of whiskey, an old habit I'd been trying to break after the hospital. Laura returned after midnight. Getting out of a taxi, she hesitated when she saw me on the porch. Mike, there was surprise and alarm in her voice. Why aren't you asleep? She smelled of alcohol and that same unfamiliar men's cologne. Her hair was slightly disheveled, and on her neck was a mark that looked like a hickey, which she tried to hide with her blouse collar. Where were you? I asked, surprised at the calmness of my voice. I told you, at an interview. It ran late, then there was dinner with potential colleagues. She faltered under my gaze. At 4 in the afternoon, and until midnight. Laura lowered her eyes. We went to a bar afterward. I thought about calling, but my phone died. I took the restaurant receipt from my pocket. And was this an interview too, 3 days ago? Her face paled, but something like relief flickered in her eyes, as if she was tired of lying. It's not what you think, she began, the standard phrase from bad movies. Then what is it, Laura? Explain it to me. She sat on the step beside me, but not too close. I was meeting with Robert, she admitted. We were discussing my work in his company. In a restaurant, over dinner with $200 wine. He's a wealthy man, Mike. He's used to a certain level, and he sees potential in me that no one else notices. I took a swig from the bottle, feeling the alcohol burn my throat. He sees in you a way to get to our land, and you're allowing him to use you. That's not true, she exclaimed. I'm just tired of all this. Of the dirt, of the lack of decent shops, of your damn silence at night and screams when you have nightmares. Her words hit harder than I expected. I knew I screamed in my sleep. I knew I woke up in cold sweat, unable to distinguish reality from the nightmare. But to hear her use this against me. And Harris offers you a way out, I asked quietly. Laura was silent, and in that silence was the answer. I stood up, feeling a sudden exhaustion. Go to sleep, Laura. We'll talk tomorrow. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual and went downstairs to the kitchen for coffee before starting work. On the table lay a folder that wasn't there yesterday. Opening it, I saw documents for the sale of the farm. A preliminary agreement in the name of Harris's company, already signed by Laura on my behalf. Next to it was an old power of attorney that I had given her before my last deployment to handle current affairs. Fury flooded me. Clutching the documents in my hand, I went out to the porch where Laura was sitting with a cup of coffee, flipping through a magazine. What the hell is this? I threw the papers on the table in front of her. She flinched but quickly composed herself. I was just exploring options, Mike. The offer is very generous, 3 times the market price. We could buy a house somewhere by the ocean, maybe even in San Diego. You signed papers behind my back, using a power of attorney that I gave you to pay bills, not to sell my heritage. Our heritage, she snapped. I'm your wife, or have you forgotten? And the documents aren't in force yet, they need notarization. I took a deep breath, trying to calm down. The land is not for sale, Laura. This is the Donovan ancestral farm. My grandfather built this house. My father invested his whole life in this land. And me? Her eyes blazed with anger. What about me, Mike? I'm tired of this life, of the constant dirt of... She fell silent, as if realizing she was repeating yesterday's conversation. If you're so unhappy here, maybe you should leave. The words escaped before I could think them through. Laura looked at me with wide eyes. Are you kicking me out? No, I shook my head. I'm just saying that if you can't be happy with me here, then maybe you should find your happiness somewhere else. She opened her mouth to respond, but at that moment the sound of an approaching car was heard. We both turned. An old, battered SUV that I had never seen before was approaching the house. Are you expecting someone? Laura asked tensely. I shook my head, instinctively preparing for possible danger. Damn war, it never fully lets go. The car stopped, and an emaciated man with disheveled red hair and sunken eyes got out with difficulty. His face was covered with dust and dried blood. He leaned heavily on the hood, as if ready to fall at any second. I didn't immediately recognize my former fellow serviceman Thomas "Doc" Riley, the military medic who had pulled me back from the brink after the explosion in Kandahar. The same Doc whom everyone thought had died 5 years ago during an operation in Colombia. Donovan, help, was all he could manage before pointing to the back seat of the car. I rushed to the car and saw a teenager with bronze skin and black hair lying unconscious. His shoulder and chest were wrapped in blood-soaked bandages. Carefully, trying not to cause additional pain, I carried him out of the car and into the house, laying him on the couch in the living room. Laura, setting aside our differences, helped Doc get to the armchair and brought water. What happened? Who is this? I asked while she retrieved the first aid kit. Doc took several greedy gulps of water before he could speak. "I didn't die in that operation," he began in a breaking voice. "I was taken prisoner. Drug cartel. 5 years in hell." He coughed, choking on the memories. "This woman, Maria, his mother, she helped me escape. They killed her in front of the boy." I examined the teenager's wounds. A gunshot wound, but clean, went straight through. The boy was about 15, no more. Despite the wound and unconscious state, his face expressed some strange determination. "Who shot him?" I asked, applying a fresh bandage to the wound. "Cartel people," replied Doc, beginning to come to his senses. "They're hunting him because of documents he has, evidence of the cartel's connection with American businessmen. If these papers get to the right place, many big shots will be in trouble." Laura, who was treating the boy's wounds, suddenly froze. "Wait, so this is a child from Colombia. How is he connected to you?" Doc and I exchanged heavy glances. He took a deep breath. "His name is Diego, his mother Maria. You remember her, Mike, in Bogota during that operation against the drug cartel, before you were wounded." Maria, of course I remembered her. The young nurse with shining black eyes and a warm smile that made you forget about the war, at least for a few hours. We had spent just a few weeks together before my injury and emergency evacuation. I never thought I would meet her again, but I always remembered her warmly. But I felt the blood draining from my face. God, 15 years ago. 15 years and 3 months to be exact, nodded Doc. Maria always knew who the father of her child was. She told him about you, kept your photograph. When I was captured, I ended up in the same clinic where she worked. Small world, huh? Mike, this boy is your son. I looked at the boy in shock, searching for and finding my own features in his. The same stubborn chin, the same line of eyebrows. I was overcome with mixed feelings. Shock, disbelief, guilt, and then a sudden, piercing sense of responsibility. "Why didn't she tell me?" I asked, still unable to grasp the reality of what was happening. "I would have." "What would you have done, Mike?" Doc interrupted me. "You were a Marine with constant deployments to hot spots. Your relationship was just a coincidence and an episode. She loved you but didn't want to ruin your life." Laura, shocked by this revelation, backed away to the wall. "Wow, you have a son. All these years you had a child you didn't bother to tell me about." "I didn't know myself," I replied, not taking my eyes off Diego. "I swear I didn't know. Besides, this all happened before we even met." At that moment, the boy began to regain consciousness. His eyes, exactly like his mother's, opened wide with fear. He tried to get up but immediately fell back from the pain. "Don Estamos, Quinn's son," he asked Doc in Spanish. "Where are we? Who are these people?" Doc answered him in the same language, pointing to me. "You're safe. This is your father, Diego. We found him." The boy looked at me with an evaluating gaze for a long time. Recognition flashed in his eyes, then disappointment, and finally, wariness. "Tu eres mi padre," he asked directly. "You are my father." I remembered my Spanish from special operations times. "Sí soy yo," yes, I am. Diego turned to the wall, muttering. "Demasiado tard," too late. Two short words, but they cut to the heart sharper than any knife. There was so much pain in them, so many unspoken reproaches, that for a moment I forgot how to breathe. Doc continued to explain the situation. "The people hunting Diego are very dangerous. They're already in the country, I'm sure, and they won't stop until they get the documents and silence all witnesses." At that moment, the sound of an approaching car was heard. I looked out the window and saw Harris's luxury black SUV. Next to it stood two men of clearly Latin American appearance with alert eyes and the tense postures of professional bodyguards. "Laura, what is he doing here?" I turned to my wife, suddenly understanding what was happening. "Did you call him? Tell him I found the sales documents." From her frightened look, I knew the guess was correct. "We need to get Doc and the boy to the basement," I commanded, quickly. At that moment, everything changed. Past and future collided at one point. My unknown son, a former comrade who was thought dead, a wife who had betrayed me, and an enemy at the gates. But the strangest thing, I suddenly felt amazing clarity. As if all these years after the war I had been wandering in a fog, and now I could finally see the road ahead. The Donovan ancestral home was supposed to be my refuge, a place of healing from the war. Now it had turned into a fortress that would have to be defended, and I was ready for it. Chapter 2: Strangers and Kin. I pushed them into the basement as quickly as I could. Doc, wincing from pain in his old wounds, helped me carry the semi-conscious Diego down the narrow stairs into the cold cellar, built by my grandfather as a shelter in case of nuclear war. Thick concrete walls, old preserves on shelves, a dusty folding cot in the corner, the perfect place for those who need to disappear. When Harris's black SUV stopped at the house, I had already gone upstairs and was standing on the porch, clutching an old army knife in my pocket, the only weapon that was at hand. Laura went out to meet the guests, wringing her hands and trying to look casual. It wasn't working well. I was always amazed at how quickly a person could transform from civilian to soldier. Just feel the danger and there you are, scanning the terrain, assessing threats, looking for cover and escape routes. Right now I saw not a businessman in an expensive suit but an opponent. And judging by his entourage, two sturdy guys with the cold eyes of professional killers, the threat was more than real. "Mike," Harris smiled with false cordiality, "I hope I'm not interrupting. Laura said you found the documents we discussed and you have questions." "Yes, there are questions," I replied, maintaining outward calm. "For example, why is my wife signing papers behind my back? And why are you offering a below-market price for the farm while promising her mountains of gold?" Harris paused, surveying the yard and house, as if evaluating the cost. "Mike, let's be realistic. This farm is falling apart. The land is depleted. It will take years and hundreds of thousands of dollars of investment to bring it back to life. My offer is a life preserver, not exploitation." I stepped forward. "Maybe I don't want a life preserver. Maybe I want to bring back to life what my grandfather built. This is the Donovan ancestral home, Harris. It's not for sale." Laura tried to intervene. "Mike, let's at least hear the specific numbers." "There's nothing to talk about," I cut her off. "The documents are illegal and I don't recognize them. Now, if you don't mind, I have a lot of work." Harris lost his mask of friendliness. His face hardened. "You're making a mistake, Donovan. A big mistake. The whole town is moving toward the future and you're clinging to the past. Just like in the war, you don't see the full picture." One of Harris's Latin American escorts suddenly showed interest in the tire tracks from Doc's car on the driveway. He bent down, ran his finger over the fresh track in the mud, then whispered something in Harris's ear, who immediately changed expression. "Has someone visited you today?" he asked as if casually. "The mailman," I lied, "brought a package with tractor parts." Harris paused for a long moment, studying me. "Well, think about my offer. I'm a patient man, but not infinitely so." As they were leaving, I noticed how the bodyguard furtively photographed the house and yard on his phone. Bad sign. Very bad. As soon as Harris's car disappeared from view, Laura grabbed my sleeve. "Mike, you need to be careful. Those men with him. They're not ordinary bodyguards. There's something in their eyes." "I know," I interrupted her. "And do you understand what you've dragged us into?" She looked away. I didn't think it was so serious. He seemed so normal, talked about business, about developing the town. "Oh, I'm sure he's very convincing." There was bitterness in my voice. "Especially when offering you your dream job and expensive dinners." Laura flushed. "You have no right to judge me. You brought me to this backwater and didn't even ask what I wanted. And now we have a wounded child and my friend, whom everyone thought was dead, in our basement. And they're being hunted by people who clearly won't hesitate to kill us all. So your grievances will have to wait. I went down to the cellar, where Doc had already settled Diego on the cot and treated his wound with fresh bandages from the first aid kit that Laura had brought. "How is he?" I asked quietly. "He'll live," answered Doc, wiping his hands with a tattered towel. "The bullet went straight through, only hit soft tissue, but he needs rest and antibiotics. Serious antibiotics, not those in a home first aid kit." Diego was lying with his eyes open, staring at the ceiling. His face was impassive, but I had seen enough such expressions to know. Beneath this mask was a storm of emotions. "Do you speak English?" I asked him. "Yes," he replied with a slight accent. "Mom taught me, said it might come in handy when I find you." There was reproach in his words, but I couldn't blame him. "I'm sorry I didn't know about you," I said, sitting on the edge of the cot. "If I had known—" "What?" he interrupted me. "What would you have done? Left the army, brought us to America?" He laughed bitterly. "Mom never blamed you. She said you were a soldier, you had your own path. She was proud of you." His words hit me harder than any accusation. I felt a lump rise in my throat. Maria, a girl I knew for just a few weeks, with whom I shared a bed between assignments, turned out to be better, nobler than me. She raised my son alone, in a dangerous country, never saying a bad word to him about the father he never saw. "Who are the people hunting you?" I asked, changing the subject. Diego was silent, so Doc answered. "The Northern Star Cartel, one of the most brutal in Colombia. They don't just deal drugs, they control entire regions, bribe politicians, have connections with big business in the U.S. And these businessmen aren't to their liking," I guessed. "Maria worked at a clinic through which cartel money was laundered," continued Doc. "She collected information for years, photographs of meetings, recordings of conversations, bank statements. When I was captured, she helped me escape. They killed her." His voice broke. "In front of Diego. He managed to escape with the documents she had collected as insurance. They contain names, dates, amounts, enough to send several very influential people on both sides of the border to prison." I looked at Diego, who still wasn't looking at me. "And you came here to find me. Why?" "Because Mom said you were brave," he answered quietly. "That you protect the innocent, that you're a just man." He pronounced the last words with such doubt that it was like being punched in the gut. In his eyes I saw a silent question. "Are you really as my mother described you? Or was she wrong?" "Where are these documents now?" I asked. "In a safe place," he answered, finally turning to me. "As long as I have them, the cartel won't rest. They've sent their best man after us, Ramon Escobar. Everyone calls him the surgeon, not because he's a doctor." At this name Doc shuddered, and a chill ran down my spine. I recognized in one of Harris's bodyguards a professional killer, by the cold eyes, by the barely noticeable bulge under his jacket where a gun was surely hidden, by the way he assessed the surrounding space. And everything fell into place. "Harris is working with the cartel," I said, "and now he knows you're here." The next morning I left Doc with Diego at the farm and went to town to meet with the sheriff. I needed help, and Mortensen was the only authority figure I could trust. Laura insisted on coming with me. She didn't want to stay at the farm with strangers, as she called them. On the way, she nervously bit her lips. What if the sheriff is in cahoots with Harris? In such small towns, everyone's connected. I shook my head. Mortensen was friends with my father. They grew up together. If I can't trust him, then I can't trust anyone. The sheriff's office was cool and smelled of coffee. Mortensen listened to me attentively, writing something in a notebook with an old-fashioned ballpoint pen. I told him about the situation, omitting details about the cartel documents and focusing on the threat to Diego. "So you suddenly have a 15-year-old son from Colombia who's being hunted by drug dealers," he summarized. "And you think Harris might be somehow connected to this? Mike, these are serious accusations." I'm not making accusations, Sheriff, I objected. I'm just describing the facts. The two Latin Americans with Harris were clearly not ordinary business partners. They were surveying the farm like a military target. The sheriff leaned back in his chair, thoughtfully tapping his pen on the table. Listen, Mike, I have no reason not to believe you. Your family has always been a pillar of the community, but suspicions are one thing and evidence is another. I can't start an investigation against the most influential man in the county based on your hunches. Laura, who had been silent until now, interjected. Sheriff, we're not asking you to arrest Harris. We just want to protect the child. Can't you organize patrols in the area, or at least check out these foreigners? The sheriff looked at her with interest. Curious to hear this from you, Mrs. Donovan, especially considering that yesterday you were ready to sell the farm to the very man you're now accusing. Laura blushed but didn't avert her gaze. I made a mistake. Now we're talking about a child's safety. Intrigued by this change, the sheriff decided to share some information. I can't officially start an investigation, but I do know a few things about Harris. For the last 6 months, the FBI has been showing interest in him. Nothing specific, just regular inquiries. And yes, he does have business partners from Latin America who are financing his resort project. He presents them as investors from a respected Colombian financial group. Laura and I exchanged glances. The sheriff continued. I can't give you official protection without concrete evidence of a threat, but I can make sure patrol cars pass by your farm more often, and I'll give you my personal phone number. Call at the slightest suspicion. When we left the sheriff's office, I noticed Harris's black SUV in the parking lot near the building. I pointed it out to Laura. See, he's watching us. She swallowed nervously, wrapping her arms around herself as if she had suddenly gotten cold. God, Mike, what have I gotten us into? Leaving the sheriff's office, we ran into a woman carrying a stack of medical records. Surprised, she dropped several folders which I helped collect. Thank you, she said with a slight smile. You must be Mike Donovan. I'm Anna Clark. I work at the local clinic. I heard you've returned to your farm. I was surprised that she knew me. News travels fast in small towns, especially when it's about the return of a local hero, she nodded. My father told me about your family. He treated your grandfather in the last years of his life. Anna turned out to be not just a nurse, but a retired military medic who had served in Afghanistan and Iraq. In her eyes, I saw the same understanding as in Tucker's eyes, the knowledge of what war is, not from movies or books, but firsthand. We started talking about places where we both served, about bases and hospitals, and for the first time in a long time, I felt understood without unnecessary words. Laura silently observed our conversation, and I saw in her eyes a mixture of jealousy and relief. She had never understood that part of my life that was connected to the army, and to be honest, I didn't particularly try to explain. At some point, an idea struck me. I took Anna aside and, lowering my voice, explained the situation with the wounded Diego without going into details about the cartel. An old friend brought me a son I didn't know about. The boy is wounded, gunshot through and through. We treated the wound, but he needs antibiotics and a professional examination. But we can't take him to the hospital, for a number of reasons. Anna listened without interrupting, then nodded without hesitation. I have a short day today. I can stop by and examine the boy after work. Laura approached us as we were arranging the time. Are you sure you want to get involved in this? We don't know how serious it all is. Anna looked at her with a calm, assessing gaze. Mrs. Donovan, when a child is wounded, the degree of seriousness of the situation doesn't matter. My duty is to help. There was no judgment in her words, only the confidence of a person who knows their duty. And in that moment I realized I had found an ally. In the evening, Anna came to the farm with a full bag of medications. She carefully examined Diego's wound, changed the bandages, and explained to me how to properly treat the wound in the future. The antibiotics are strong, she said, placing packages of pills on the table. Twice a day with food, and monitor his temperature. If it goes above 100, 4 degrees F, call me immediately. Diego, usually reserved and wary with me, unexpectedly opened up to Ana. She spoke to him in fluent Spanish, asking about his life in Colombia, about his mother, about his interests. And I was surprised to learn about my son, a boy who loved to play the guitar, dreamed of becoming an engineer and building bridges, who had been helping his mother at the clinic since he was 5. He's an amazing boy, Ana said later when we went out to the porch. He's been through so much but hasn't broken. There's a lot of your stubbornness and resilience in him. I don't know how to communicate with him, I admitted. He looks at me like an outsider, and I understand him. To him, I am an outsider. Ana put her hand on my shoulder. Give him time. He's confused and scared right now. He needs to be sure you're really ready to be his father, not just a person who feels obligated to help. At that moment, Laura came out to the porch. She noticed Anna's hand on my shoulder and the intimacy of our conversation. Dinner is almost ready, she said dryly. Anna, will you stay? Anna, sensing the tension, politely declined, but before leaving gave me her phone number. Call any time, day or night, if the boy's condition worsens. When she left, Laura silently cleared the table. I felt she wanted to say something but was hesitant. Thanks for helping with dinner, I said, breaking the silence. She nodded, not looking at me. I made a terrible mistake, Mike, not just with the documents. I told Harris about you being a former Marine, about waking up from nightmares at night, even about where you keep your military things. I thought it was just conversation, but he used me. There was genuine remorse in her voice, and I felt some of my anger recede. What's done is done, I said. Now we need to protect Diego and ourselves. She finally looked me in the eyes. I'm on your side, Mike, whatever happens next. I nodded, not sure if I could fully trust her, but willing to give her another chance. What I didn't know, and couldn't know, was that at that very moment, a tense meeting was taking place in Harris's luxurious office in the center of town. Sitting across from him was that same Latin American with cold eyes, Ramon Escobar, professional killer for the Northern Star cartel. Are you sure it's the same boy? Harris was asking nervously, tapping his fingers on the table. Ramon nodded. Absolutely. The tire tracks match the car the military doctor escaped in, and the man I saw through the window is definitely Thomas Riley. He's changed a lot, but it's him. Harris stood up, went to the bar, and poured himself a whiskey. This complicates everything. I just wanted to buy the land for our project, and now I have a fugitive with documents that could destroy all of us on my property. Not all of us, Ramon coldly clarified. Only those who don't know how to cover their tracks. My employers are very unhappy with how you're managing the situation, Robert. First, you couldn't legally acquire the key property, now this. Harris irritably waved him off. I was one step away from buying the farm. If that stubborn soldier hadn't unexpectedly returned, or if his little wife had been more prompt with the papers, everything would already be settled. Ramon shrugged. If only, if only. The cartel isn't interested in excuses. They're interested in results. And right now we need 2 results. Get back the documents and silence everyone who knows about them. What do you suggest? Asked Harris, trying to hide his nervousness. Kill them all and be done with it, replied Ramon. The farm is isolated, neighbors are far away. We'll surround the house at night when they're asleep, get the documents, and arrange an accident. Gas stove, leak, explosion. Such old wiring, such decrepit pipes, no one will be surprised. Harris turned pale. You're talking about murdering an entire family. There's a woman and a child there. Ramon looked at him with undisguised contempt. And you thought the millions passing through your account smelled like roses. You knew what you were getting into when you agreed to cooperate. Now is not the time for a sudden attack of conscience. Harris downed his whiskey in one gulp, surrendering. His smooth business scheme had turned into a bloody nightmare, but he had gone too far to back out. When? He asked dully. Tomorrow night, answered Ramon. My people are already on the way. Of course, I found out about all this much later. But that evening, I just felt that we had little time, and I began to prepare for defense. We can't count on police help, I said, gathering a war council in the kitchen. That means we need to defend ourselves. I laid out an old map of the farm, drawn by my grandfather, on the table. The farm has several advantages from a defense perspective. First, open fields on 3 sides, no one will approach unnoticed. Second, the old bunker in the basement, we can take shelter there if necessary. Third, the field irrigation system. If restored, it could become an unexpected trump card. Diego, who had been silent until now, suddenly showed interest. Irrigation system, how does it work? I explained the principle of the old sprinklers, which at full pressure create a real water wall around the central part of the farm. To my surprise, Diego's eyes lit up. I can help restore it. In Colombia, I worked with irrigation systems on my uncle's coffee plantations. You understand irrigation? I couldn't hide my surprise. Diego shrugged. I understand many things. When you're constantly moving, you learn everything that might be useful. There was no boasting in his voice, just a statement of fact, which made my heart clench. At 15, he had already been forced to become an adult, to learn to survive in a world that doesn't spare the weak. For the next 2 days, the farm turned into a fortified camp. I set up makeshift alarms around the perimeter, tin cans on fishing line that would rattle if someone tried to intrude. Diego, despite his wound, helped restore the irrigation system, showing unexpected technical knowledge. Doc, using his experience as a military doctor, organized something like a field hospital in the basement, prepared a supply of bandages, antiseptics, painkillers. Laura, feeling out of place among these military preparations, took charge of supplies, food, water, flashlights, batteries. She drove to town for purchases, but each time returned increasingly nervous, insisting she was being followed. While working on the irrigation system, Diego and I began to cautiously get to know each other. I asked him about his life, about Maria, about what she was like. At first, he answered briefly, but gradually opened up. She always spoke well of you, he admitted. Even when I felt bad about not having a father like other children, she never spoke ill of you. She said you were a brave man who protected others. I was touched by these words. Why didn't she contact me? I would have helped. Diego thought for a moment. She said you had your own path, your own destiny, that you were needed by the world for other things, not to get stuck in a Colombian village with a woman you barely knew and a child you didn't ask for. These words struck me to the core, such selflessness, such devotion. I felt a lump rise in my throat. She was an amazing woman. I wish I had known her better. Diego nodded. Yes, she was special. She taught me never to give up no matter what happens. He paused, then added, she would be proud of what you're doing now, that you're protecting me even without knowing me. In the evening, after finishing work on the irrigation system, I found an old collection of baseball cards I had kept since childhood. To my surprise, Diego showed genuine interest, telling me that in Colombia he also loved baseball, although he rarely got to play. I never had a real glove, he admitted. We made them from cardboard and leather scraps. I found 2 old baseball gloves and a ball in the barn. Later, when your shoulder is better, we could toss the ball around a bit. An uncertain but sincere smile flickered on Diego's face. I'd like that. And in that moment, I realized I was ready to give my life to protect this boy. Not out of duty or guilt, but because he was my flesh and blood, a part of me I didn't know but already loved. My son, my future, the continuation of the Donovan line. That evening I stood on the porch for a long time, looking at the stars and listening to the night sounds. For the first time in a long while, I felt I had found my place in the world. I had returned to the ancestral home not just to lick my wounds, but to start a new life. And I was ready to fight for it with all my strength. But somewhere beyond the hills, hidden by the darkness of night, people were already gathering whose only goal was to take everything from me, my son, my farm, and life itself. I could feel their approach with every cell of my body, like a predator senses an approaching storm. And I knew tomorrow the real war would begin. Chapter 3, Seed. The morning was quiet, too quiet. Standing on the porch with a cup of coffee, I listened to this deafening calm, feeling growing anxiety. 18 years of war had taught me. The silence before battle is the most terrifying sound in the world. Everyone in the house was still asleep. Doc and Diego on cots in the basement, which we had turned into a shelter. Laura upstairs in the bedroom, nervously tossing and turning all night. She insisted on going to town today, supposedly for groceries, but I understood it wasn't just about that. She may still have hoped to settle the situation with Harris. I let her go, not because I believed in the success of her venture, but because I knew you can't hold a person by force, even if that person is your wife. And it would have seemed somewhat strange from the outside if our usual trips to town suddenly stopped, as if we suspected something. Then I didn't know that this decision would change everything. Laura was driving to town, nervously tapping her fingers on the steering wheel. In the morning we had barely spoken. I gave her money for groceries and antibiotics for Diego, and she avoided looking me in the eye. As a goodbye, I simply said, "Be careful." She nodded and drove away without looking back. In the center of town, she parked near the cafe where she was supposed to meet Harris. They had arranged this by phone. Laura waited, nervously checking the time on her phone. Harris was late, which was not like him at all. Suddenly, she noticed him coming out of an office building on the other side of the street. Next to him walked Ramon, that same Latin American with cold eyes. They were arguing tensely about something. When the cafe door opened, admitting a new customer, Laura caught Ramon's words. By midnight, everything must be finished. No witnesses. Harris noticed her and immediately changed his demeanor. Tension gave way to a smile. His voice became velvety. Ramon intercepted his glance, saw Laura, and just as instantly transformed from an aggressive opponent into a polite businessman. This synchronized transition frightened her more than the words she had heard. "Laura, sorry for being late," said Harris, approaching her table. "Final touches of a business meeting." Ramon smiled, but his eyes remained cold like a shark's. "Nice to see you again, Mrs. Donovan. I hope your husband and his guests are in good health." Laura felt everything inside turn cold. "Yes, thank you for your concern." Harris threw a quick glance at Ramon. "Weren't you rushing to another meeting?" Ramon nodded. "Of course. It was nice to see you, Mrs. Donovan. Give my warm regards to your husband and his son, Diego Wright." When Ramon left, Laura realized she had walked into a trap. She had never mentioned the boy's name in conversations with Harris. "How does he know Diego's name?" she asked directly. "I never told you what Mike's son is called." Harris hesitated but quickly recovered. "You must have mentioned it, or maybe I heard it in town. News travels fast." The attempt to change the subject didn't work. Now Laura knew for certain. She needed to get back to the farm as soon as possible and warn us. She looked at her watch. "Sorry, but I need to go. I promised to be back for dinner." On the way home, Laura couldn't shake the oppressive feeling of anxiety. Ramon's phrase about midnight and no witnesses echoed in her head. They were planning murder, her husband, the boy, everyone at the farm. Maybe her too. When she was approaching the farm, it was already getting dark. Laura noticed a black SUV parked on a dirt road nearby. There was someone sitting in the car, but in the twilight, she couldn't make out their face. She stepped on the gas, eager to reach home sooner. That's how she described that fateful meeting to me then, and I believed her. All day, Diego, Doc, and I spent strengthening the farm's defenses. I found an old hunting rifle and checked the ammunition. Not much, but better than nothing. Doc made several tripwires from available materials, primitive signaling devices around the perimeter. Diego, despite his wound, worked alongside the adults as an assistant. We were just poring over a map of the farm when we heard Laura's car stop with screeching tires at the porch. A second later, she burst into the house, breathless from running quickly, her face contorted with fear. "They're coming tonight," she blurted out. "Harris and Ramon, I heard them discussing it. By midnight everything must be finished. No witnesses, that's what Ramon said." I instantly gathered myself. "Are you sure they were talking about us?" "I can't be absolutely certain," she admitted. "But when Ramon saw me, he specifically mentioned Diego by name, a name I never mentioned to him. They're watching us, Mike. And on the way back, I saw a car parked by the road." Doc and I exchanged glances. We had little time left. "Doc, activate the perimeter alarm. Laura." I fell silent, still not sure if I could fully trust her after her recent betrayal. "I'm with you," she said firmly, straightening her shoulders. "Whatever happens." "Good. Gather everything necessary and take it to the bunker. Food, water, medications. If something goes wrong, you and Diego will hide there." "And you?" There was genuine concern in her voice. "I'll defend the farm," I replied, surprised at how natural the words sounded. "This is the Donovan ancestral home. I won't let them take it." Closer to midnight, I climbed into the attic from where the surrounding area was well visible. The moon, almost full, flooded the fields with silvery light, making even the smallest details of the landscape visible. Raising an old naval binoculars that had belonged to my grandfather, I slowly surveyed the surroundings. At first all was quiet, but then I noticed movement at the edge of the forest, dark figures moving from tree to tree. I counted at least 6 people, armed and clearly coordinating their actions. "They're here," I reported, coming down to the kitchen, where Doc was checking the hunting rifle's charge. At least 6 people, armed, surrounding the house around the perimeter. Diego, sitting nearby, was tensely listening to the night sounds. "I hear cars," he said quietly. Laura, pale with fear but composed, was finishing packing supplies for the bunker. "What now?" she asked in a whisper. "Now we wait," I replied, checking the rifle. "We don't shoot first. Let them make the first move." The tense waiting was broken by the ringing of the improvised alarm system, tin cans on the western border of the property. I nodded to Doc. "It's starting. Diego, you know what to do. Wait for my signal. Laura, be ready to take Diego to the bunker." I took a position at the living room window facing west. Doc covered the eastern direction. We turned off the lights in the house to avoid being easy targets. The first shot came unexpectedly. A bullet shattered the kitchen window, fragments scattered across the floor. Laura screamed, but Diego instantly pulled her into cover, behind a massive oak table turned on its side. "Range finding," I calmly commented. "They're checking if anyone's home and ready to respond." The shots continued, methodically, one at a time, aiming at all the windows on the first floor. Doc and I didn't respond, conserving ammunition and not revealing our positions. "Why aren't we shooting back?" Laura whispered. "Because they're expecting it," explained Diego with tactical wisdom surprising for his age. "If we start shooting, they'll see the flashes and know where we are." After a series of single shots, silence fell. Then Ramon's voice came from the darkness. "Donovan, we know you're in there. We have no problems with you or your wife. We just want the boy and the documents he stole. Hand them over and we'll leave." I didn't answer, signaling everyone to remain silent. Donovan, Ramon continued. Think about it. This brat isn't even your real son. You don't know him. Is it worth risking your and your wife's lives for him? I glanced at Diego, whose face in the half-darkness seemed carved from stone. The boy was clearly expecting that I might agree to the deal. He is my son, I finally replied with a voice full of determination. And this is my land. Leave while you still can. After these words, everything happened rapidly. Dark figures rushed toward the house from 3 sides. I noticed 2 trying to approach the back door. Now, I commanded, and Doc opened fire with the rifle, aiming not at the people but at the ground in front of them, raising fountains of mud and forcing the attackers to retreat. I shot precisely, wounding one of them in the leg. He fell with a scream and his comrades dragged him back, toward the edge of the forest. Suddenly, an explosion came from the direction of the barn. One of Doc's homemade traps, a tripwire with an improvised grenade, was triggered when 2 attackers tried to come from the rear. The fierce firefight continued for several minutes. Doc and I skillfully used the advantages of defenders, knowledge of the terrain and prepared positions. The attackers, not expecting such serious resistance, retreated to the forest. They'll regroup, I said, reloading the rifle. That was just a reconnaissance by fire. In the temporary respite that followed, I checked on the household's condition. Doc unharmed, Diego frightened but holding up stoically. Laura pale but also all right. I need to tell you something, she said, taking me aside. This is all because of me, not just the farm sale documents. I told Harris about Diego, about his wound, about you and Doc hiding him. I looked at her with bitterness. I knew you were communicating with him about the documents, but telling him about Diego, why, Laura? I thought he would help, she explained desperately. He said he had connections in the immigration service, that he could help the boy get documents. I didn't know he was connected to the cartel. I shook my head. You just didn't want to know. All the signs were there. Our conversation was interrupted by a new sound, the rustle of tires on the gravel driveway. I rushed to the window and saw Harris's luxury SUV stopped in front of the house. Harris himself got out of the car, nervously looking around. Donovan, he shouted, I've come to talk, no weapons. I signaled Doc to keep Harris in his sights, while I went out to the porch, clutching the rifle at the ready. Speak from there, I commanded. Listen, began Harris, nervously swallowing. This has all gotten out of hand. I just wanted to buy the farm for my project. I didn't know these Colombians would react like this to the boy. You're lying, I replied calmly. You knew perfectly well who you were dealing with. These investors are a cartel and you know it. Harris paled. Fine, yes, I knew they weren't completely clean, but I didn't sign up for murder. I'm a businessman, not a killer. What do you want, Harris? I want to help, he replied, wiping sweat from his forehead. Ramon has gone crazy. He wants to kill everyone, including me, if I don't help him. Let's make a deal. You give up the documents the boy has, I guarantee your safety. Everyone stays alive, including the child. At that moment, Laura came out to the porch. Robert, you promised to help Diego with documents. You said you would protect him. Harris looked surprised at her appearance. Laura, go back inside. It's dangerous out here. No, she replied, taking a step forward. I want to know the truth. Did you use me to get to Mike, to Diego? Suddenly, a shot rang out from the darkness. The bullet hit her in the shoulder and she fell. I rushed to her, dragging her back into the house, while Doc opened fire on the forest where the shot had come from. Harris fled to his car in panic but didn't make it. A bullet caught him in the back. He fell onto the gravel, trying to crawl to the car, but the next shot seemed to finish him. He went still, sprawled on the ground. I dragged the wounded Laura into the house. The wound was serious but not fatal. The bullet had gone through cleanly, not hitting an artery. Doc, I shouted, I need help, Laura's wounded. Doc quickly examined the wound, using his medical experience. We need to stop the bleeding and apply a bandage. Diego, bring my bag. While Doc attended to Laura, I held her hand. She looked at me with eyes clouded by pain. I'm sorry, I'm such a fool. I thought I knew what I wanted. Big house, status, wealth. But none of it is worth anything. Hush, I calmed her. Save your strength. Laura squeezed my hand. No, I have to say, I'm to blame for everything. I told Harris about the hiding place where Diego keeps the documents. In the old mill, he forced me. Said otherwise he couldn't help the boy. Diego and I exchanged alarmed glances. I never imagined my wife had such a loose tongue. Now they know where to look, I said. We need to rehide the documents. After the first attack, an ominous silence fell. I used this time to rehide Diego's documents in a new place, in my grandfather's old safe built into the basement wall, which only family members knew about. Doc was finishing treating Laura's wound. She's lost a lot of blood, he told me. She urgently needs real medical help, not field surgery. I nodded. I'll call Anna. Apart from her, no one can save her life now. Calling Anna, I quickly explained the situation. She promised to come as soon as possible, but warned that she had seen strange cars on the road from town. Soon after the call, there was a loud knock at the door. I prepared to shoot, but heard a familiar voice. It's Eddie Tucker. I'm not alone. Reverend Jones and several other guys are with us. Cautiously opening the door, I saw Eddie, the Reverend, and 5 other farmers from neighboring properties, all armed with hunting rifles and looking determined. What are you doing here? I asked in surprise. We heard shots and word spread through town, replied Eddie, nodding toward Diego peering out from behind my back. That Harris's people attacked you, that they want to take the farm and harm the child. I turned to Diego. You told them when? Diego shrugged embarrassedly. On the first day when we were fixing the irrigation system, I wasn't sure I could fully trust you. Eddie came to help, and I told him part of the story. He gave me his phone number just in case. Eddie clapped Diego on his good shoulder. Smart kid, and he did the right thing. We farmers have to stick together against people like Harris. Reverend Jones examined the wounded Laura. I brought medications from the church first aid kit. How is she? She'll live, replied Doc, but she needs hospitalization. The reinforcements radically changed the situation. I quickly distributed the people to positions around the house. Eddie Tucker, also a Vietnam veteran, helped coordinate the defense. Suddenly shots rang out from the direction of the barn. A new attack had begun. This time the attackers acted more aggressively, using suppressing fire tactics. They want us to stay in cover while the assault team enters the house. I analyzed the situation. Classic tactics. Under the cover of intensive fire, 3 attackers tried to approach the house from the south side, but ran into the farmers waiting for them. A fierce firefight ensued. In the midst of the battle, I noticed movement near the old mill, a half-ruined building at the edge of the property. In the moonlight, I made out the figure of a man laboriously making his way to the mill. It was Harris, who, it turned out, wasn't killed, just wounded. He knew about the hiding place from Laura, I thought. Maybe he thinks the documents are still there. Doc, watch the house, I said. I'll check the mill. Using natural cover, I made my way to the old building. Inside, as I had expected, Harris was frantically rummaging through old boxes, looking for the hiding place Laura had mentioned. Looking for something, Harris? I asked, aiming the rifle at him. He turned sharply, clutching a bleeding wound in his side. Donovan, listen, this has all gotten out of hand. I didn't want anyone to get hurt. But you brought killers here, I replied. People who are hunting a child, my son. I didn't know he was your son when this all started, Harris justified himself. I just wanted the land. Then Ramon found out about the boy and the documents, and everything went sideways. Where are the documents? Have you found them already? Harris looked around nervously. I haven't found them, I swear. Laura mentioned a hiding place somewhere here, but there was nothing. At that moment, Diego appeared in the doorway of the mill, having followed me against my orders to stay in the house. Harris, in desperation, made a sudden movement, pulling out a pistol. I instinctively threw myself between him and Diego. A shot rang out, but the bullet only grazed my shoulder. With one blow, I knocked the weapon out of Harris's hands. We grappled in a brutal hand-to-hand fight. Despite his wound, Harris proved a strong opponent. He landed several painful blows on me, one of which hit my old chest wound, momentarily taking my breath away. Harris took advantage of this, knocking me down and picking up the fallen rifle. Sorry, Donovan, nothing personal, just business. In the second when he was ready to shoot, Diego threw himself at him, throwing off his aim. The shot went into the ceiling, bringing down part of the dilapidated roof. I quickly recovered and together with my son overcame Harris. He lost his balance and fell onto a pile of debris, hitting his head. You have no idea what you've gotten into, Donovan, Harris gasped, wiping blood from his face. These people won't stop. They'll kill everyone, including the boy, you, your whole family. Not today, I replied, helping Diego to his feet. Let's go, son. We need to get back to the house. We left the wounded Harris in the mill and headed to the house, where the firefight seemed to be dying down. Returning to the house, we saw that the attackers had retreated after a fierce exchange of fire. The farmers were celebrating, believing they had repelled the attack. But I, with my combat experience, felt this was the calm before the storm. I noticed that Anna's car had pulled up to the house. The nurse was already inside, providing assistance to the wounded Laura and several farmers who had received minor injuries. Laura needs to be evacuated to the hospital, Anna told me, removing her bloodied gloves. I've stabilized her condition, but she needs surgery. The roads are still unsafe, I replied. Ramon's people could set up an ambush. Suddenly, new sounds came from the fields, not gunshots, but the crackling of flames. Looking out the window, I saw with horror that the fields around the farm were burning. The fire spread quickly, forming a ring of fire around the homestead. They've set the fields on fire, I shouted. They want to smoke us out with fire. Reverend Jones quickly organized a chain for fighting the fire, but soon it became clear that we couldn't stop the fire with our own resources. The grass, too dry after summer, burned like gunpowder. The irrigation system, I remembered. Diego, start the irrigation we repaired yesterday together. It's our only chance. Diego rushed to the makeshift control panel, but at that moment the lights went out in the house. Someone had cut the power lines. The generator, I commanded. There's an old generator in the barn. Doc and one of the farmers rushed to the barn, but didn't make it. Shots came from the direction of the fields, forcing them to return to the house. The ring of fire was closing around the homestead, smoke beginning to seep through the windows. Everyone gathered in the living room, trying to figure out what to do next. Suddenly, the living room door swung open and Ramon walked in, holding a gun to Anna's temple. Behind him followed two of his men, who held the others at gunpoint. Weapons on the floor, ordered Ramon, slowly. We were forced to obey, seeing that Anna's life was in danger. How did you get in here? I asked, carefully lowering the rifle. Through the basement, Ramon replied with a cold smile. Your Cold War bunker has an exit to the river, very convenient. One of Ramon's men brought Laura out from the bedroom, who could barely stand from weakness after her wound. They made her sit next to Anna. So Donovan, said Ramon, looking over those gathered, I need two things, the boy and the documents. Give them to me and your friends will stay alive. Continue to resist and they will die one by one, starting with these beautiful ladies. I looked at Diego. The boy was pale, but there was no fear in his eyes, only determination and some signal that I didn't immediately understand. "The documents are with Harris," I lied. "We left him wounded in the mill." "You're lying," replied Ramon. "My people found Harris. He's dead and there was nothing on him." I felt the weight of the package in the inner pocket of my jacket and realized Ramon was bluffing. "Then we have a problem," I said, "because I don't know where the documents are." Ramon went over to Laura and put a gun to her head. "Maybe your wife knows. She turned out to be a very useful source of information for Harris." Laura, despite the pain and fear, found the strength to respond. "I know nothing. I told Harris about the hiding place, but I didn't know what was actually there." Ramon smirked. "Too bad, very unfortunate." He moved the gun to Anna. "What about the lovely nurse? Are you ready to sacrifice her for papers and a boy you don't even know?" Anna's eyes met mine. There was no pleading in them, only calm acceptance of the situation and a silent message: "Don't give in." Outside the windows, the flames rose higher, smoke filling the house. Time was running out. But at that moment, I noticed that Diego had unobtrusively approached the overturned table, under which was hidden the backup control panel for the emergency power system. He was waiting for my signal. "All right," I said, raising my hands. "You win. The documents are with me." I slowly reached for my inner pocket. Ramon smirked. "You see how simple it is. Now tell the boy to come here." I looked at Diego and said in Spanish, "Tu mater te enseño, que a veces es necesario retroceder para ganar." Your mother taught you that sometimes you need to step back to win. Diego's eyes widened. He immediately understood. This was a code phrase we had agreed upon during the installation of the irrigation system. In the next second, he pressed the button, and power went to the irrigation system. Powerful sprinklers turned on, dousing the fire and creating a water curtain around the house. Simultaneously, I threw myself at Ramon, knocking him down. The gun fired, but the bullet went into the ceiling. A desperate struggle began. The farmers pounced on Ramon's men. Doc helped Anna free Laura. Reverend Jones, despite his age, showed surprising agility, knocking out one of the thugs with a heavy crucifix to the head. Ramon proved to be a strong and dangerous opponent, but 2 against 1, unfair conditions even for a professional killer. Diego and I, acting as a unit, were able to overcome him. At the decisive moment, Diego repeated the move that had already saved me in the mill. He knocked Ramon down when he almost reached for the gun. I pinned Ramon to the floor, pressing my knee to his chest. "This is the end, surgeon. Your people have scattered, the fire is out, and the documents will soon be with the FBI." He looked at me with hatred, but also with some strange respect. "You don't know who you've tangled with, Donovan. The cartel never forgets its enemies." "And I never forget those who threaten my family," I replied, using Eddie's handcuffs to chain him to the radiator. "You can pass that on to your bosses when you're rotting in federal prison." Going out to the porch, I saw how the irrigation system continued to work, dousing the last areas of the fire. Dawn was coloring the sky in pink tones, promising a new day. The farm, though damaged, still stood. Diego came up to me and stood next to me. "We won," he said quietly, still not quite believing it. I put my hand on his shoulder. "Thanks to you, you're a real Donovan." For the first time, I saw a sincere, open smile on his face. And at that moment, I realized that the ancestral home had found a new guardian. Chapter 4: New Roots. An old wisdom says, "After the storm comes silence," but no one warns how ringing and strange this silence will be. The dawn after the night of the siege colored the sky in the colors of a fire that was no more. The burned earth around the farm had blackened, but the house stood, wounded, with broken windows and bullet marks on the walls, but not broken, like ourselves. Ramon, handcuffed to the cast-iron radiator, silently watched us with the unblinking gaze of a predator in a cage. His people had either fled or been captured by the neighboring farmers. Harris, bleeding out, lay on the porch. We had carried him from the mill, but he had no chance of survival. Sheriff Mortensen arrived at the farm with 2 deputies when smoke was still drifting over the fields. His car with flashing lights looked like a ship sailing through a sea of fog. "Good Lord," was all he said, getting out of the car and surveying the destruction. I heard gunshots, but I didn't think. Explaining what had happened turned out to be more difficult than I had anticipated. How to tell about the cartel, the documents, my unknown son, and my wife's betrayal, so that it didn't sound like the ravings of a madman. "Start from the beginning," suggested the sheriff when we sat down at the burned kitchen table. "And don't leave anything out." While I was talking, Anna, the sheriff's deputies, and the arrived ambulance crew attended to the wounded. Laura was among the first to be taken to the hospital. The shoulder wound was serious but not fatal. Diego, whose condition had worsened again due to the reopened wound, was next. I insisted on going with him, but he stopped me. "I'll manage," he said with an unexpected firmness for a 15-year-old. "Finish everything here and come. Don't worry." From his tone, I understood. He was afraid I might not come, that I might abandon him as I had once unintentionally abandoned his mother. "I'll come," I promised. "As soon as I hand over the documents to the sheriff. You're not alone, son." For a moment his eyes warmed, and I saw a glimmer of trust in them. Then the paramedics took him away. The handover of the documents triggered a whole chain of events. The sheriff, after reviewing the contents of the package, immediately contacted the FBI. Within 2 hours, there were already 4 agents in crisp suits at my farm, examining every inch of the territory and interrogating witnesses. Ramon was taken away in handcuffs, escorted by 2 black SUVs with federal plates. His glance, thrown at me over his shoulder, promised that this wasn't the end. But I knew for him everything was over. With such evidence and Harris's murder on his conscience, the surgeon wouldn't see freedom for the rest of his days. Harris's body was taken to the morgue. Somehow his death brought me no satisfaction, only bitterness at the thought that a man had traded his soul for the illusion of power and money. By evening, the house had emptied. Only I, Doc, and Anna remained, who insisted on checking our wounds before leaving. The neighboring farmers had already left, promising to return tomorrow to help with repairs. "You should go to the hospital," said Anna after finishing treating the scratch on my shoulder. "Diego needs you, and Laura too." I nodded, feeling infinite exhaustion. "What will happen to the farm?" asked Doc, looking at the destruction. "It stood its ground," I replied, "and we'll restore it." At the hospital, I went to Diego first. He lay in a small ward connected to an IV, pale but calm. Seeing me, he smiled slightly. "You came," he said, and in this simple phrase was a whole universe of unspoken feelings. "Of course I came." I sat beside his bed. "How are you?" "The doctor says I'll be fine. The wound is clean, but I need to stay here for a few days." We were silent, then he asked, "What happens next? With me, I mean. Will you send me back to Colombia?" There was so much uncertainty in his voice that my heart ached. This boy had crossed a continent to find me, and now didn't know if I wanted him. "You'll stay with me," I said without hesitation. "If you want, of course. We'll take care of all the documents. You're my son, Diego, and the Donovan farm is your home if that's what you want." His eyes filled with tears, which he tried to hide. "What about Laura? She's your wife. She doesn't want me there." "Laura," I sighed. "Laura and I are separating. This was decided even before you appeared. We wanted different things from life. She won't mind, believe me." He nodded as if he needed to hear this. Then he said quietly, "Mom would have liked the farm. She always wanted to live somewhere quiet, away from the city." "Tell me about her," I asked. "About your life." And he began to tell about the little house in the mountains of Colombia where they lived until they had to flee, about how she taught him to play the guitar by the light of a kerosene lamp, about how she showed him a photograph of an American soldier, me, and said that his father was a good man who protected other people. I listened and the world around disappeared. And when he finished, I realized I was crying for the first time in many years. After Diego, I went to see Laura. She lay in a separate ward, pale with a bandaged shoulder. Seeing me, she tried to smile, but the smile was forced. "How are you?" I asked, sitting next to her. "I'll live," she weakly shrugged her healthy shoulder. "The doctor said in a couple of weeks I'll be able to move my arm. The shoulder will heal completely, unlike us." In her eyes was a question that I couldn't ignore. "Laura, No need, Mike," she interrupted me. "I understand everything. We tried, but it didn't work, and after what I did—" She turned away, hiding tears. "Forgive me. I really didn't know what I was getting into with Harris. I just wanted a different life," I finished for her. "I know, and I don't blame you for it. You deserve to find what will make you happy." She looked at me gratefully. "You're an amazing man, Mike Donovan. Much better than I deserve." "That's not true," I objected. "We're just made for different paths." We talked for a long time. About the future, about the divorce that would be officially processed when Laura recovered, about where she would go afterward. Her sister in Boston offered shelter and a job at a marketing firm. "I heard Diego is staying with you," she said before I left. "Yes, if he wants." "He will want." She smiled sincerely for the first time in a long while. "I've seen how he looks at you, Mike, like you're a hero." I snorted. "Some hero I am. To him, the real deal." Laura paused, then added, "You know, I got jealous when I first saw you talking with him. You looked at him so openly. You hadn't looked at me like that for a long time." Her words caught me off guard, but I realized she was right. With Diego, I was real, without masks and protective barriers that I had built over years of war. "I hope you find someone you'll look at the same way," I said, shaking her hand goodbye. Her eyes flashed. "And you, it seems, have already found." I didn't immediately understand who she was talking about, but then I caught her hint. "Anna," I felt myself blushing. "We're just—" "Not just," Laura gently objected. "I can see it in how you change around her, how your voice becomes softer. Don't miss this chance, Mike." A month later, the Donovan farm looked completely different. The fields burned during the fire had begun to green after the pouring autumn rains. The house was repaired, new windows, fresh paint, fixed roof. Diego, Doc, and I, with help from neighbors, worked from dawn till dusk, restoring what had been destroyed. Doc turned out to be a talented carpenter. The old mill, where the fight with Harris had taken place, under his guidance turned into a cozy studio for Diego. I installed an old wooden workbench there, and the boy began crafting miniature models of bridges, following his dream of becoming an engineer. The documents that Diego had brought from Colombia led to the arrest of several high-ranking members of the cartel and their American partners. The FBI offered us the Witness Protection Program, new names, new place of residence, but we refused. "I'm not going to run anymore," said Diego when I asked his opinion. "I don't want to hide for the rest of my life. Ramon is in prison, and the cartel will find new markets and forget about me." There was so much determination in his words that I didn't argue. Instead, we installed a modern security system and kept the old hunting rifle ready, just in case. Laura was discharged from the hospital after 2 weeks. Before leaving for Boston, she stopped by to say goodbye, no longer as a wife, but as a person closing one chapter of life and opening another. We sat on the porch, looking out over the fields, and at some point Laura said something that surprised me. "Now I understand why your grandfather cherished this land so much, not because of money or status. Generations of your family have put down roots here. That's something I never had, a sense of belonging. There was no bitterness in her words, only realization. She had found her path, and that path led away from Castle Rock, away from the Donovan farm, away from me. Among those who became part of our new life, Anna held a special place. At first, she would come several times a week to check how Diego's wounds were healing. Then she started bringing books, engineering textbooks for him, old detective novels for me. One evening we were sitting on the porch, I, Diego, Doc, and Anna. Twilight was enveloping the fields in a soft purple light. Diego was showing drawings of a bridge he was designing for the stream on the northern border of the property. Anna, sitting next to me, accidentally touched my hand with hers. Our eyes met, and I realized I didn't want this moment to end. "Will you stay for dinner?" I asked. "With pleasure," she replied, and her smile was warmer than any fire. Later, when Diego and Doc had gone inside, we remained alone on the porch, looking at the stars. "What are you thinking about?" asked Anna. "About the strange paths of fate," I replied. "I came back here to lick my wounds and hide from the world, and instead I found a son, friends, a new purpose. And you?" She smiled. "Sometimes the most serious wounds are healed not by isolation, but by new connections." I carefully took her hand, and she didn't pull away. The next day, Diego suggested making a new sign for the farm. The old one with the simple inscription, Donovan Farm, established 1887, hung on the main gate, but time and weather had almost erased the letters. We worked on it together. I cut the board from solid oak, he burned in the letters from my sketch. Doc helped with the fastenings, and in the evening Anna joined us, bringing special protective varnish for wood. We turned the installation of the new sign into a small ceremony. Reverend Jones, Eddie Tucker, Sheriff Mortensen, and other neighbors gathered at the farm gates. Doc playfully saluted when Diego and I removed the cover from our creation. Donovan Farm, established 1887, reborn 2023. In the evening, when everyone had left, Diego and I sat on the porch. He played on an old guitar that Eddie had found at a yard sale in a neighboring town, a Colombian melody his mother had taught him to play. "You know," he said, pausing, "Mom was right about you." "In what way?" "That you're a good person, that you protect those dear to you." He was silent for a while, then added, "I'm glad I found you." "And I'm glad you found me," I replied, feeling something warm spreading in my chest. Anna's voice came from the house, calling us to dinner. Doc was already busy setting out plates, arguing with her about which wine best complements baked potatoes. Diego and I looked at each other and smiled in sync. Then we got up and went to the house, to the people who had become our family, to the ancestral home that had not just survived, but found new life. The war still sometimes visited me in nightmares. But now, when I woke up from a nightmare, Anna was beside me, and my son slept in the next room. And that changed everything. They say you can't step into the same river twice. But sometimes you can return home and find that during your absence it has become better than you remembered. Like an old tree that seems dead after winter, but with the coming of spring puts out new, strong shoots. The new roots of the Donovan ancestral home went deep into the earth, nourishing not only the present but also the future. If you enjoyed this story, support the author with a like, subscribe to the channel, and share your emotions in the comments. Thank you.